how can I make room for me? How can I make room for my needs? Because if you don't do that, these layers of stress, trauma, symptoms, niggles, illnesses, they will build up and up and up. And then there'll be life stresses and challenges. And it'll get to a point where your system will be so overwhelmed that you will hit burnout. Your body will say, I'm not going to work anymore. And also about this, having that label of incurable or chronic. Chronic means that it will be here forever. I sometimes think that for all of the negatives and for all of the suffering and for all of the trauma, actually, there's been so much growth in that for me. It has significantly changed my life, in some ways for the worst, yes, but in some ways probably better, because without getting really unwell, I wouldn't have focused on myself and on my well-being. I certainly wouldn't have written a 70,000 word book to try and help other people. There is light to be found in the darkness. There is hope to be found in the despair.
Welcome to the 51%, the podcast where we cut through the noise and get back to basics when it comes to women's health. Through expert insights and powerful personal stories, we help you tune into what really matters: your body, your well-being, your life. No one-size-fits-all advice, just real conversations to help you understand your health on your terms. But before we dive in, I've got a quick favour to ask. Please hit subscribe and join the 51% community on our website. It's free and helps us grow, reach more women, and create events that really speak to the health and wealth challenges we all face. And finally, just so you know, everything shared is for information only. It's not medical or financial advice, and always speak to a qualified expert for support that's right for you. Emily, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on. I know today we're going to be talking about chronic illness and your journey with that, and of course what led you to that, and your journey with being the CEO of the local council that you're, in your area, which is a phenomenal job that you've done. But I guess the core concept is, we're talking about what transpired from that in terms of burnout and the illness that you faced as a result of all of this. So could you please introduce yourself and start talking about your journey from what you were doing to what you're doing now? And that would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Shreya, and hello to all your listeners as well. Yeah, I'm Emily Forbes, as you've said, and recently I've been through a really big change in my life. I was the CEO at my local town council for the last nearly 9 years. And during that time, it was a stressful role. And I had been becoming unwell for a while. But I think that the layers of chronic stress of the role, the layers of managing the illness and the symptoms all led to a sort of culmination, really, of my body just saying, no, we can't do this anymore. And I've had a few surgeries along the way, and I had some recovery time. I went back to work twice and tried to go back to the full-time pace and doing the role, which I loved and which I was really good at, but it just wasn't working. I couldn't hold it all. So, and by that I mean I couldn't hold a 40-hour job plus, because there were lots of evening meetings as well, plus holding, being a mum and the family, plus holding being chronically unwell.
Yeah.
So I suppose for those that don't know me, I suffer with really severe gastrointestinal dysmotility, which most people won't have heard of. But essentially, my esophagus doesn't pull food down correctly. And then when it gets into my stomach is very slow to empty. And then my whole gut transit is also just on a sort of very go slow, paralyzed kind of state. So it means that I'm living off liquid intake. And that's been the case now for 4 years. And the few surgeries I've had and the operations I've had have tried to help with the esophagus and the reflux coming up from the stomach and the hernia, and all sort of different considerations of what it might be and why it might, have kicked off and been not working. But it's not just been about the nutritional intake for me. It's been a lot of my body systems have also really suffered. So I've got a lot of joint pain, hip pain. I've been diagnosed from the rheumatologist with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. And my question is all of this a culmination of the body sort of saying, you've been pushing too hard for too long, and we need to make you stop in order for you to stop? So that's why I've come to the point where I actually ended my role on ill health, which at 40 is pretty unheard of, really.
Yeah.
But it was because, the symptoms that I have to manage and an incurable chronic illness, it doesn't fit with that busy 100 miles an hour lifestyle. And the sort of type A achiever in me really finds that difficult. There's still friction there. I'm working through the acceptance of it all. But I thought, well, if I can't do all of those things that I used to do, and if this is now where I'm currently at presently, what can I do differently to work with what I've got and work with where I am? And accept that having chronic illness or different symptoms or diagnoses or whatever you might be going through, it can also be, a door opening to a new chapter. So I feel that I've sort of closed that last chapter of my life with gratitude for all that I've learned from it and for, the impact I've made and the difference. And now I'm going into the next part of my life with a sort of new purpose around, well, how can I use all of this trauma, suffering, adversity, all the really difficult bits I've been through, how can I use that to help others? And that's where I am today. And I've just published my first book, and it's called Too Hard to Swallow. And it's all about this journey from illness to wellness, this journey from being in the sort of thick of suffering and not knowing which way to turn and where to go for help, to trying to come to some kind of acceptance, whilst also living as well as I possibly can within the illness that I have.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think, with chronic illness, there are lots of different types of chronic illness. And someone might think, well, I don't have what you have, so how could I possibly kind of relate to that? But it's not specifically just about the chronic illness. It's everything that goes around that. And, looking at you, when I first met you, I can't tell that you have a chronic illness because it's not visible. And these are the things that we need to think about, the invisible disabilities and the invisible illnesses that people face on a day-to-day basis. Now, I mean, I know in your book you talk about your journey and everything, which is great. And I would encourage anyone who is going through a chronic illness to read books like this, because it's not just about the specific illness, which you might not be able to relate to, but it's everything around that, which you could potentially relate to, which could help you through and give you ideas and give you all sorts of information that can lead you down a better path as well. Now, I just want to rewind with your chronic illness. When do you think the symptoms started? Because it's not something that I'm assuming it's not something that you've had since, birth or since your teenage years and things like that. So when did you start feeling the symptoms and thinking, hold on a minute, something doesn't feel right? But I'm assuming you just carried on.
Yeah, so in the book, I've tried to look back and think, okay, when did these start happening? Because, everyone always says, right, okay, let's try and get to the root cause, or let's try and get back to when the symptoms began. And as a child, I was quite a choky child. So by that, I mean, I did used to choke on food occasionally. Things like super noodles. I would sort of almost inhale noodles or spaghetti. It was the sort of I always was quite spluttery around eating it. But
Yeah.
it was laughed off as, oh, just always sort of splutters and chokes on whenever she has something like that. Couple of occasions where, again, I had food stuck, and it was sort of thought to be, oh, you've not chewed your food properly, or something's been stuck in your throat. But I started going to the GP about it because I had a few episodes where, after eating, I had this really strange sensation. So it was as if my whole sort of food pipe was full and being stuffed with cotton wool. It was like a really filling feeling that went right up to sort of almost like, it felt like it was right up to my throat.
Mm.
And at one time I sort of fainted with it. It was like I couldn't get air in, and I couldn't sort of swallow, but I couldn't breathe. And excuse me. And another time, and the same thing happened, but it was always after food, but not directly when I was eating, but just afterwards.
Mm.
And every time I'd go to the GP, or at one point it was to a sort of an emergency minor injuries unit because it happened at work.
Was this during your teens?
No, it was early 20s, actually.
Early 20s.
Early 20s.
Mm.
And on every occasion I was told, we think you're having a panic attack.
Okay. Right.
We think this is anxiety. We think this is all of these feelings that you're talking about, these sensations. I felt like I had a tight belt across my chest, and I couldn't get enough air in, but I couldn't also swallow my saliva. Like, everything was constricted. And every time I was sent home, you need to, maybe you're stressed, maybe you're in a stressful role, which at the time, in my early 20s, I was managing other staff, I was, working, I had a young family. Or maybe it's because you've just gone back to work after maternity leave, and you've got a young baby who's still not sleeping in the nights, and panic can come out of nowhere, anxiety can come out of nowhere, it can be subconscious, and it was always fobbed off. And now we now know that today as medical gaslighting.
Yeah.
Being told by a range of doctors, it wasn't just one. I had, I'd been to my GP a few times. I'd been to an out of hours minor injuries unit. I'd also been to A&E in an ambulance when I fainted at work once with it. And every time it was the same. Oh, maybe you're just, maybe it's just anxiety. Maybe your body's stressed. Maybe you're being told, that you need to take some time out. And I thought, well, that's not it. I'm adamant that is not it. So I went back to the GP time and time again. And then I said, look, I've got this feeling in my throat. It's like there's something in there when I'm after eating. So it's almost like you can't clear your swallow. And I said to them, I know you're not going to understand this, but I said, it's like I have to have 3 or 4 swallows for every swallow of food. It was getting worse and worse and worse. And eventually I got sent to ENT, so ear, nose and throat department. And they said to me, oh, we think it's a throat issue. We think that where you had your tonsils out, because I used to suffer a lot with tonsillitis as a child, there's a little bit of your tonsil that's been left, and there's a little tonsil, sort of like a seed, a cyst that's in there. We think that's the issue. We'll take it out and you'll be able to swallow fine again. So went in for the operation, they took it out. A few weeks later, still having the same issues with food. Still feeling like it was getting stuck, still feeling like it wasn't clearing. And the feeling was really high up here in my throat. It wasn't down in my chest to begin with. Now I know that that's like a sort of transferred feeling. So that is the feeling of where it's getting stuck at the base of the esophagus, but it sort of transfers the feeling up to the back of your throat. So then I got transferred from ENT to the esophageal surgeon in the upper gastrointestinal unit. And I've been under him now for that was about 2019. So the problems then is that COVID hit the world, the pandemic,
Mm.
hospital appointments got cancelled, everything took a long time. And I think that's why then a lot of my tests and diagnostics took a lot longer than they should have done to finally
Mm.
work out what was going on. But when I did have all the tests and the barium swallows, and there's a test that tests the pressure of your swallow, it showed that, 4 out of 5 swallows weren't working, which I knew. I told them that,
Mm.
but no one really heard my calls for help in the beginning.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I was really, really unwell that they started doing something about it. So I was about 12 kilo lighter than I am now. So I lost a lot of weight. I couldn't swallow any kind of solid food. Even I was taking a lot out of my diet and just went to like really mushy, sloppy, and then in the end I was on liquid only because I physically couldn't get the more stodgier food through the valve that was at the base of the esophagus. And
Mm.
it's concerning that it takes to the point where you're really, really physically unwell,
Yeah.
laying on a sofa, off work sick, can't get any nutrition in, for people to actually turn around and say, okay, we need to do something here. And I think that period of diagnosis for me, that lengthy period of diagnosis, made me worse, in honesty. And I'm not saying that's the fault of the NHS, but if you look back, if I probably got my medical records, we're probably talking at about like 2007, 8, 9, where I'm going back and forth to the GP with swallowing problems and with choking
Mm.
episodes and with, something's gotten stuck and it's not working properly. And we're now in 2025 and I've
Yeah.
just left full-time work, had 2 surgeries, and got to the point of knowing that this is an incurable chronic issue that I'm now living with. So that's a huge period of time to not only be going through the problems, but for anyone that's suffering with medical issues or symptoms, like the diagnosis time and that medical gaslighting issue, and having to do all that research and that patient advocacy for yourself, it can feel really lonely. So I really understand that journey.
Yeah.
And I think my book is for anyone going through anything like this, whether you're going through something where you're not being listened to, you're not being heard, you feel alone with it. There
Mm.
are so many other people out there really going through what you've been through. You're absolutely not alone. And I think knowing that can give you a sense of hope about the future as well, and about, okay, well, if others can get through this, then I can find a better pathway forward, even if where I'm currently at is a really hard place.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that if, around 18 years ago when all this started, things were progressed a lot quicker and there were, investigations that should have happened, perhaps 15 to 18 years ago, do you think it wouldn't have led you down the path of where you're at now? And do you think it could have been cured? Or has it always been this thing that would have always been incurable? Do you know that information?
I think if it was found sooner and I was helped sooner,
Yeah.
then maybe it wouldn't have gotten to the place it's now at. Because
Mm.
I think what I've learned is that when your body is continually, persistently, and consistently fighting against something,
Yeah.
it becomes more inflamed. It becomes, it's got to overcompensate somewhere, hasn't it? And
Mm.
my nutrition has been so poor for so long that affects
Yeah.
your vitamins, your minerals, your deficiencies, your iron levels, having iron infusions and B12 injections and all of these other things.
Mm.
It affects your hip, your bones, and your dent. So the iller you are for longer.
Yeah.
If you think about the body as this organism that just wants to be well and safe and reach homeostasis and be operating in its like most optimum way, my body has not been working in the most optimized, regulated, functional way for a very long time. And I also think that having a stressful job, stress is known to impact any illness.
Yeah.
Or any symptoms, not just chronic illness, but if you suffer with headaches and you're in stressful environments all the time, they'll be worse. If you suffer with, I don't know, maybe some people suffer with sort of shoulder pain or neck pain or back pain. And again, there's a lot of research and evidence that if you're under psychological stress and emotional stress, or any kind of trauma happens in your life, then again, that can be exacerbated.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of research that suggests that chronic stress can actually lead to autoimmune conditions. So some of my issues, I have been to rheumatology, and some of them are possibly autoimmune. Now, does that mean that because over time I've been adding layers of stress to the load, so my body's already stressed because physically and biologically it's not functioning properly, then emotionally I'm stressed because I'm in a difficult working environment where I'm suffering, I'm constantly dealing with public complaints or staffing issues, that's emotionally going to drain it psychologically. And so I think that if you add all of those layers up, then yes, I think it's probably made the spasms worse, the esophageal muscles, not work as well. As soon as I noticed that as soon as I went on sick leave, it was like a relief to my body. It's like I was allowing myself to be ill. So for once I was saying, do you know what? I'm going to surrender to this, and I'm going to allow myself to rest and to experience these symptoms and to be ill and to not be worrying about striving and being the best and doing the work and, showing up every day and being this overachiever. I think my body began to relax and think, wow, this is what it feels like to not be chronically in that hyper aroused nervous system state where you're continually on edge. And I've learned that if you're hyper aroused emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and physically, then how can you possibly be thriving and flourishing? You're continually in survival mode. So how can you bring yourself into that, I suppose, nourishing, nurturing mode of, let's look at my whole well-being. And, this is a concept that I talk about in my book. It's about whole wellness. So it's not just about the physical.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the mental. And I know that societally, we've had a big shift from the physical to the mental, but I'm not sure we've talked enough about the emotional. And I'm not sure we've talked enough about the spiritual and that feeling of, well, I have a place in this world and my purpose and, my connection with something bigger than myself. Just because I'm suffering with chronic illness, it doesn't mean that I haven't got all of those things. And just because I can't physically do the role I used to do and have that identity that I used to have, it doesn't mean that I can't still play an important part in our world.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about that, certainly from like a medical and a clinical perspective. We chop people up into little bits and we, take things out and we remove this and that and we give people pills and medicine.
Yeah.
But do we actually say, and how are you as an individual, as a human being, how are you doing? I'm not sure anyone asked me that question ever along this journey.
I don't think kind of Western medicine takes all of that into consideration, to be honest. It feels like, talking to more and more women and more GPs, doctors, consultants, it literally is, right, what's going on? Okay, you've got a headache. Take some ibuprofen for a few weeks and see how that goes. I've still got a headache. Right. Let's do a brain scan, maybe, you know, and see, is there maybe a tumor or something else going on? You know, that might be months or years down the line potentially, and it probably is. And then it's just masking things with pills constantly, which is fine. I'm not saying, you know, and I've never said medication, pills, you know, the Western way of doing things is incorrect. There is definitely a time and a place for all of that. But everything else is forgotten almost when you go and see your GP. And I understand now more and more that that can be an issue, especially now that I've discovered that a lot of the medication, some of the medication at least, isn't even tested on women. And, you know, there's no research on whether it even works on a woman's body. So where do you go from that as well?
I mean, I've done a huge amount of reading and research over the last few years, and spoken to lots of different, you know, medical professionals as well.
Yeah.
And it seems that this medical model is a pill for every ill, doesn't it? And we've talked about that before, I think, societally, and how we're trying to move away and move more towards other tools to manage wellness. And at the end of my book, I actually talk about developing a prescription for wellness. And by that, I mean, what does that mean to you? So what keeps me well might be very different to what keeps someone else well.
Yeah.
And there may be some role for medication within that. And I'm still on medications. You know, if I didn't have my sort of liquid anti-nausea medications I take 3 times a day, with my stomach being so overfull all the time, and regurgitation and anti-reflux. So I'm still on medications. But I also need a lot of calming practices. I need time for space, for relaxation. I need nervous system regulation, which can be as much as laying down and having, you know, 5 minutes to just relax the body, do a body scan, do some deep breathing exercises, which I've put in the book for people too. Because calming the nervous system and finding a point of regulation can sometimes help just as much as me taking some anti-nausea or anti-spasm medication, because you're trying to get the body into a rest and digest mode instead of being in that fight or flight mode. And a lot of Eastern, you know, sort of historical Eastern ways of helping people, healing and wellness, I think can really be used in tandem with the Western medical model.
Yeah.
And we've started to discover what's called the biopsychosocial model of health and well-being, which is what's going on biologically, what's going on psychologically, and what's going on in the external environment. And then I would add to that, well, actually, we need a biopsycho emotion and spiritual, you know, a biopsycho-emoto quantum model, this which looks at all of the aspects of who we are, how we're existing in the world that we're living in, because it's not just what you're ingesting and digesting nutritionally, it's what you're taking in from the news or from the books you read or from the people that you surround yourself with, or from the toxic workplace that you're in, or from the, you know, environment where you're not breathing clean, fresh air, or you're not drinking, you know, safe water in some parts of the world. There's so many different things that we need to consider. It's not just the sort of biological medical bit, even though that's a key part of the journey. It's not the only part. And I think it's about having this whole lifestyle approach, I suppose. So lifestyle as health and well-being, how can we use that? And I know that they're doing more social prescribing now. So some GPs will prescribe exercise, or they'll prescribe maybe counselling or psychotherapy to help process emotions, or even prescribing soft, slow movement, like maybe yin yoga or Tai Chi, or, you know, to try and regulate the body a bit better. But it's not the norm, and it's not run of the mill, and it's not, I suppose, it's not mainstreamed into how we're managing illness and wellness in society. And I think there's more we need to do. And I'm here to advocate for that and to advocate for invisible illness and invisible disability too. Just because you can articulate well and you can, learn and research and you've got curiosity and you can put makeup on and you look good, it doesn't mean that you're not going through hell behind that mask.
Yeah.
And a phrase I use in my book is that, often people that smile the widest have the heaviest loads. And we can't see that because we're not looking behind that. We're not looking behind the sort of surface level mask. And for years, women have been invisible in lots of ways in society. We're pushing through the boundaries and we're trying to, break the barriers on that. Are we doing that for chronic illness? I don't know yet if we're successfully doing that. I think there's more to do.
Yeah, absolutely. There is definitely a lot more to do. I want to touch upon you talking about the emotional and spiritual versus the mental and physical a bit more, because it's something that I didn't really think for me, it was, mental or physical. I know about obviously emotional and spiritual, but how do you intertwine the two and what's the difference? What are the key differences?
So I think that from an emotional perspective, it's quite difficult sometimes to label the feelings that you're having. So yeah, from an emotional perspective, I think having chronic illness is a really difficult thing to process. It's almost like going through a grief process. And people may have heard of the sort of the grief cycle in emotional processing. So first it's denial, then it's bargaining and trying to understand it, then it's anger and frustration and I don't want to be like this. Then it can move into depression and really low mood and feeling in quite a dark place. And then finally to acceptance. And I think with a chronic illness grief, it's almost like a living grief because you're experiencing it every day.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can go through that cycle in a sort of oscillation and you can go through it over and over again. So it might be that first you're in denial that I'm going to be like this forever. I don't want to have an incurable illness. And then you're thinking, well, maybe I haven't got it. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe I need more tests. Maybe I can search for a cure. Maybe I can read more books and more journals and more medical, knowledge on this. And you're sort of trying to bargain with it and think, well, how can I not be in this place? And then you go through the anger and the frustration of, I suppose, realizing, actually, this is life now. I have to do things differently. I personally can't go on a 10-mile hike anymore, or I can't go for a run because of my fatigue and my energy levels, or I can't get up and do the school run anymore. And it's you can feel really angry at that. And then that can, give you a really low mood and lead you to quite a dark place and a place of isolation and loneliness. And you've got all these feelings that you need to process, but it's very difficult when no one else around you understands what's going on. So you can feel quite alone with it. And then you can help yourself by moving to that acceptance, which takes time. So that emotional cycle of almost processing all of those emotions, naming them, feeling them, allowing yourself to be really uncomfortable with sitting in quite a dark place. That's all part of going through chronic illness. And it's something that you might feel at the beginning, but also, I've returned back to those stages throughout, because if you have a new diagnosis or a new set of symptoms, or maybe you've got to trial new medication, or you've got to explain yourself to the next person and the next person, all those feelings can bubble up again, and they're not necessarily thoughts. So it's not necessarily the psychological side of it, it's the somatic feeling, and how can you express that? Well, there's something called a feelings wheel that people can look up online. There's also, I've put a certain iteration of it in my book. And sometimes can be quite hard to name the feeling that you've got. You know, is it grief? Is it shame? Is it anger? Is it uncertainty? Is it anxiety about the future? And these are all really normal feelings to have that
Yeah.
bring certain sensations in your body. And if you're already coping with symptoms, the emotional sensation attached to that symptom can then trigger a thought. So then we're in that sort of cognitive behavioral triangle where a sensation in your body triggers a thought, which then triggers the feeling. And then, you know, that can go round and round and round. And it's how do we break that loop? How do we feel sort of comfortable and safe enough to feel the feelings somatically, to feel the symptoms that you're having, the physical symptoms of the illness, but to feel the emotions too, and then allow that to pass through us. And to almost accept that that is now, that's okay. It's okay to be feeling all of those things instead of trying to push it away or fight against it. Because as soon as you try and fight against an emotion, that emotion becomes repressed, it becomes stuck. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest it then becomes encoded in, you know, the visceral cells of your body, and that trauma can get stuck in the body, and that if we don't process emotions, maybe we're not processing our trauma. We're not really coming to terms with the illness, we're sort of masking it.
Yeah.
And I know that certainly from a lot of the medical research I've read on neurodivergence, masking is something that people who have a sort of type A personality, where, you know, they want to deliver and do a good job and be perfect and be hyper focused on something, you know, they also are really good at masking. And what we're trying to do with, I suppose, moving from chronic illness to wellness is how can we take that mask off? How can we take off the pretending to be fine and actually acknowledge that sometimes things are really shit, you know, be hard. And that's actually honest and authentic, and it's okay to express that. You don't have to stay in the frustrated, angry mode and hide that, because hiding your emotions can be worse for you. And I think the spiritual side of things is almost about thinking, if I know that I can't control maybe my physical symptoms and this physical illness, what can I control in life? And I can control my thoughts if you do work around maybe psychotherapy, or you work with a counsellor, or just journaling maybe to sort of get the thoughts out that you've got. I can learn to manage my emotions better, again, maybe through naming them through a feelings wheel, or maybe doing an emotional clearing exercise or something like that. And then spiritually, you can think, well, what I can control is my direction now in life, my purpose. You know, what makes me feel light and bright instead of this darkness and this despair and this hopelessness and helplessness? Where can I feel some bright energy? And I think that connection with something bigger than yourself can really help give you a sense of new purpose, new direction. And spirituality doesn't have to be about being spiritual, but it can be. There's a lot of alternative holistic healing therapies, which you can also you can also try to sort of help you going through managing different chronic illness symptoms. Reiki is one, which is energy healing, which I've tried and I found really sort of soothing. So if you're in a sort of hyper aroused, stressful state where you're spinning plates and you're managing lots of symptoms, and you want to sort of bring your body back to a really grounded place, I found really, really helpful for that. Acupuncture is another thing I've tried. You know, it's a really old Eastern medicine, like we talked about earlier, which is about realigning the sort of energy in your body and the way it's flowing and how your chi flows through, which is the word for energy. And I think it's personally done something for me. Now, it might not for you. It works differently for different people. Again, things like breath work. some people might associate that with sort of spiritual or yoga, but sometimes breath work can literally mean being able to take deeper, calmer, parasympathetic nervous system inducing breaths, which can bring the body into this place of rest and digest, which is sometimes all we need. So it doesn't have to be religious or necessarily, a connection with spirit to be spiritual. It
Yeah.
can just be about thinking inside, what does my soul need? What does my body need from a really intuitive position? And instead of thinking what you need, feeling what you need somatically. And that's where I think we're missing that spiritual and that emotional connection, because it's not just about thoughts and it's not just about the body. It's about sort of wider, energy, emotions, soul, all of those things, which holistically speaking, we are as a whole person. We're not just one part, we're not just one body system, we're all of those systems.
Yeah. I feel like now everyone wants a quick fix. And hence why, when they go to their GP, they're happy with the antibiotics or the ibuprofen or whatever that's prescribed, antidepressants, whatever it might be. And because they, a lot of people, potentially, they don't have the time to put the effort in, because, they're running on a hamster wheel, perhaps, working, kids, caring for elderly, whatever their life looks like. And that quick fix is just, right, take the ibuprofen, my headache's going to be gone for that day. And then the next day I'll have another headache and I'll take another one. And then at least I can move on with life. And I guess up to a point, that was your situation. You were working in, you were the CEO, which is a highly, I'm assuming, stressful job. And you took on all that stress, and hence it led to more symptoms and things. And I'm assuming you were masking some of that with medication, thinking, okay, I'll just take this quick fix thing, because, you had a very intense job and you had to perform. It's not something like, oh, I'm just going to not perform today and take some time out, because that job, I'm assuming, is quite intensive. Now, for people on that hamster wheel, all this stuff to do with emotional, spiritual, mental, physical, it's a lot of hard work. It's not something that, right, I'll do it for one day and I'm done and I'm sorted.
No,
It
it's
absolutely
not.
isn't. So
It's about, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, it's about consistency, persistency, and it is about the long game. And I would say my advice would be that people who feel, I don't have time for this, I don't have time for healing, are the exact people that need to make the time.
Yeah.
Because when you're at that height of cruising, I would suggest, towards burnout, because you're managing everything, but just about. So you're spinning all the plates. You're doing the school run and the working hard all day in a high pressured role, and then you're doing the after school activities, and then you're back on Zoom online in the night on meetings, and everything is this 100 miles an hour pace, nothing ever stops. If you don't stop and try and make some adjustments or adaptations in the sort of preventative side of things, your body will stop for you. Absolutely. And I've know a lot of people now, through the work that I've been doing and through speaking on my own podcast and others, that they are forced to stop by illness. And I think there's a saying that's quite a well-known saying, which is, listen to the whispers of your body before it has to scream. And I would suggest that people start listening now to the niggles and the whispers and the something's not quite right. And actually, if you can start putting things in place to manage your own mental health or your own emotional health or your own spiritual health, as well as your own physical health. You could put some really basics in place for anyone. And that is, things like trying to stick to a really good sleep routine, recognizing that our circadian rhythm is really important. And if we go to sleep at the same time every night and get up every morning, sleep is a big part of repair for the body and restoration for the body. So that's important. Hydration. That's another thing that we don't do enough of. We're rushing around, trying to get everything done and all the things on the to-do list, and we're not drinking enough and hydrating enough. Nourishment and nutrition. Now, for me, that's a difficult one because of my limited intake from a physical perspective, and which is why I have to have prescribed nutrition now. So I drink a lot of prescribed liquid nutrition. But for people that can, swallow food in a typical and a normal way, make sure you're getting your vitamins, your minerals, the importance of having nutrition for the brain as well as for the gut. The gut-brain connection, it has been researched and evidence that the food you eat affects your mood. So if you're putting all these sort of, sleep, nourishment, hydration, mindfulness and meditation is a really important way of relaxing the system. And even if you can only manage 5 minutes a day, 5 minutes is not a lot of time. And if you start making that a routine and programming it in, maybe just before you go to sleep every night, that you're gonna lay there and try and bring some calm to your body. Try and maybe visualize cool, sort of lilac-y coloured light surrounding you. Take some really deep breaths. Make your out breath longer than your in breath, and just get into that parasympathetic, relaxing place. That can, over time, bring down your resting heart rate. It's been, scientifically proven that over time, your resting heart rate will come down to a much lower level if you're starting to build these practices in. So start thinking about small little differences you can change, or even stack these habits up on other things you're doing. So when you brush your teeth in the morning, choose to do something then. When you're waiting for a kettle to boil, maybe choose to do some body scanning or mindfulness. Maybe every morning when you're making your bed, set some intentions for the day. Today's going to be a really good day. Today I'm going to be calm and collected, and I'm going to be able to use my energy how I want to use it and be productive. And I'm going to make time for rest because I deserve some rest. I deserve to give myself the energy I need to carry on with my day. And I think just these little small differences, you might not notice something straight away, but it is about the long game. And in time, you will notice that you feel, I suppose, more grounded and calmer in yourself, and then more able to tackle the stresses of life because they come, challenges come, whether you are suffering with chronic illness or not. We all still have to face other curved balls that get thrown at us. But if you've got ways of being mentally and emotionally resilient, if you've built that up in your body, you have more capacity to expand and to contract and to expand and to contract. And I think that kind of elasticity, or the plasticity of your brain, neuroplasticity, being able to rewire and think new thoughts, and all of that is so important. And it is the long game. It's about building it up, doing something little every day. I'm not cured of my swallowing and my chronic digestive issues, but what I certainly am is more emotionally regulated, I would say, more able to approach stressful situations with much more distance and sort of calmness and ability to focus on them for what they are from quite an objective perspective, being able to look at the bigger picture. And I think a lot of that is because I've done a lot of work on meditation and mindfulness and on myself and filling my cup up. You know,
Yeah.
we don't fill our cups up enough as women. We
Mm.
pour out everything to everyone. We pour our energy into everyone. Um, pour my energy into the children. I poured my energy into the work and my organization, and I poured my energy into my friends and my and other people. And no wonder then you end up completely depleted.
Mm.
Your battery's not running on empty from chronic fatigue or chronic illness. It's running on empty emotionally.
Yeah.
So I would, yeah, encourage people to fill themselves back up with whatever that might mean for you. And everything is individual. You know, we're all individuals. We've
Mm.
all have things that will work for us, things that won't work for us. You know, I'm not suggesting that things that I've done in my book will work for everyone, but they're in there because you can see what other people have tried and tested, and see if they work for you. Essentially, I think building this prescription for wellness for yourself is about building a toolbox of things that work for you that you can
Mm.
go to whenever you need them. So, you know, if you feel actually I'm on this hamster wheel, I can't get off, I'm running too fast, then you can choose a tool from your toolbox that you know, I know this is going to work for me in this instance.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think building in new things to do, like, whether it's some form of movement or just meditating, or, when I say meditating, people often think, oh, my mind has to be completely clear. No, your thoughts are going to go through like crazy, because that's what the mind is. The mind is there for thoughts to just constantly go in and out. But when you're on that, you think, oh, I don't have time to meditate. You absolutely do, especially if, or for mindfulness, especially if you go to work and you're on some form of commute, whether that's on a flight, flight's a bit elaborate, but some people might be a bus or a train, whatever that commute is, or a car, taxi. You can take even 1 minute to do a bit of mindfulness, and instead of scrolling on your phone or reading a book, whatever. And then, so there is time, it's how you frame that time. And there is time when you're pouring that cup of coffee or doing, like you said, incorporate it into the daily habits that you do without thinking, like brushing your teeth or going to the toilet or whatever these things are. And not thinking that, yeah, this is going to be an overnight transformation. It's not. It's never going to be an overnight thing. It's always going to take weeks, months, years to transform the way you think and the way you do things. But again, people want instant gratification.
And I think it's also about, sometimes people will listen to this or watch it and think, I can't possibly do more. I can't add this in. I can't do this differently, because they are overwhelmed. So I would also suggest that some action that you can take is, what can you let go of? So what can you do less of, which then opens up the space to do more of something different. So it's not about adding, oh, this is another task on my task list, or this is another thing I should do, I have to do, I must do. Let's, reframe that and think, okay, what can I choose to do differently? What can I choose to let go of so that I can choose to do more of something else? Now, that might be delegating something where you can, whether that's workload or maybe in home life. Can you, delegate one of the chores or some of the tasks, or share a pickup or a drop off maybe with someone if you're ferrying children around? Can you choose not to do a certain house chore or task that day? Does it really matter? Can it wait till the next day to give yourself some space to maybe just sit and be for 10 minutes? So let's not just think about doing more of different things and adding to our plates, but let's also think, what can we delegate? What can we delete? What do we not need to do? Where can we
Yeah.
take the pressure off? what's going to feel good to me today, and where can I take the pressure off things that aren't going to feel good to me. Now, I know that, for some people, there'll be elements maybe of your work or of your job that you don't like doing. And there are some things that we just, we're contracted to do them, we have to do them, and you sort of got to get on with it. But if you take a look at your day, I'm sure there are things that you could do differently or let go of in order to open up that little bit of space for you. And it's about, how can I make room for me? How can I make room for my needs?
Yeah.
Just for a small window of the day. Because if you don't do that, these layers of stress, of trauma, of symptoms, niggles, illnesses, they will build up and up and up. And then there'll be life stresses and challenges. And it'll get to a point where your system will be so overwhelmed that you will hit burnout.
Yeah.
And your body will say, I'm not going to work anymore.
Yeah. And that, again, that's different for, everyone as well. Some people that might happen within a year. Some people it might happen within 10 years. It just depends. But it potentially will happen. And then it will get to the stage where people will look back like you and I perhaps would and think, I wish I didn't do that. I wish I lived my life differently. And then, all these regrets seep in, and, we're trying to avoid that and start getting you think about these things like right now.
Yes.
Right now, not tomorrow, not, in the next 10 minutes. Just start thinking about it now, wherever you are. Emily, you say that your chronic illness is incurable. Now, for me, I feel like, really, like, how can it be incurable? Like, how do you manage that? Because it's almost like, for me, I'm looking at it as in, potentially you won't be able to eat solid foods for the rest of your life. Now, is that something that's, that is it, you can't. And I'm also looking at you thinking, you've transformed your way of thinking and the way you do things around, your symptoms and your illness and things like that. So if you can do that, that everyone can do this. It's just the way you think about it. So just going back to, the food, is that it? And how do you know that, yeah, that's it? Is it something that someone said, no, this is it, you will be on a liquid diet now?
Yeah. I think that there's potential. I'm hopeful that there's always potential for new medical breakthroughs. I have learned that, like, the esophagus and the sort of stomach and gastric kind of the area of medicine is very young. So it hasn't actually been looked into, investigated and worked on as much as maybe other areas have, or other diseases or whatever. So I have now been referred to a different gastroenterologist to see if there's anything else I can do about the sort of movement of the gut. So the way, if I could get my stomach to empty quicker, could I then put more food in? If I could get more food through the system, so if it wasn't so slow. So I'm hopeful that there might be some future where I eat more closer to solid food, but I'm also, I suppose I've come to terms with the fact that I'm probably never going to eat a burger and chips again, thinking of like the stodgiest kind of food, because if my esophagus hasn't been working for so long, and the peristalsis, which is the way the muscles move, has been so slow, then it's part of a system that you can't train. So it's not like a muscle in your arm that you can train to be bigger.
Yeah.
It's part of the autonomic system that works by itself. So I am fairly, I suppose, not comfortable, but accepting. I'm fairly accepting of the fact that I'll always be on liquid food, if not a sort of pureed level diet. I'd like to get more closer to puree because there are certain things that will work with my system at the moment, and there are certain things that don't. For example, I can't eat mashed potato. And you think, okay, well, that should be quite easy to go through something. Whereas if I puree carrots, I can eat those. So it's like a very fine line between the texture of what will work and what won't.
The
And I'm
consistency is
willing,
different though as well.
yeah,
Just going by, when I used to puree food for my
yes,
kids when they were
yes,
babies, like things like butternut squash and carrots, the consistency is really different to potatoes.
exactly.
Potatoes is stodgier, and in fact, even mashed potato can get stuck in your throat. Like
Mm,
it really can, because it's not as smooth, I
no.
guess.
So it's been a real sort of trial and error around what will work, what won't work. And then I've got some sort of fail safes that I know that if I swallow that, I'll be okay. Whereas sometimes I'll try and have, like baby porridge, ready breck.
Yeah.
If I make that up really liquidy and loosely, it will go through. But if I make it a little bit too much on the thick side, it will sit in my sort of chest for hours and hours. And the aftermath is horrific. So yeah, it is trial and error, but I am accepting because I've had 2 surgeries. So the first surgery I had was called a Nissen fundoplication, which sounds like a big, a long way to describe effectively making a bit of a collar at the base of the esophagus using the stomach to stop the stomach emptying upwards, so coming up into the esophagus. So I had a hernia and all the acid was always coming up. And that's probably what caused a lot of the inflammation in the esophagus, probably what caused a lot of the regurgitation, probably, all of that sort of probably what caused every time I put something in, my body was trying to expel it. So after that operation, I couldn't get anything through the valve at the bottom thicker than water. It went the other way. So I was thinking, uh-oh. Then I had to have more surgery where they redid that operation again for me, opened it a little bit wider. So now the esophageal surgeon is saying you should be able to get things through now, whereas the stomach is still not working enough for it to process that. So I suppose in answer to the question, could I manage could the symptoms improve by going to see a gastroenterologist and maybe looking at the movement of the system? Maybe, I don't know. But am I likely to live with severe gastrointestinal dysmotility for life? Yes, I think that's the answer. And I think most of the clinicians that I've seen have said that that is the case now.
Yeah. Is it quite a rare thing that you
I
have?
think dysphagia, which is the clinical word for problems swallowing, is seen a lot more in sort of post-stroke patients or more elderly people who have, because obviously the other thing to think about is as we all get older, our bodies deteriorate, our muscles deteriorate. So as you get older, the swallowing muscles will probably deteriorate anyway. And mine are already in a condition where they're not working as well as they could be. I have discussed tube feeding previously, but that's being kept in the wings, let's say, as the last resort for if the nutrition became such a problem that I was losing weight again, then that could be an option. But currently I'm managing to maintain my weight with a combination of this prescribed nutrition as well as essentially liquidizing food. And also then managing my energy output. Whereas if any of that is out of alignment, I'll start losing weight again because my my output goes up, my energy usage goes up, therefore my weight will start coming down. So it's all a really fine balance. And I suppose what I'm learning is how can I adapt and adjust to a way of managing all of this within my capacity and also wanting to still have purpose. And that's been the biggest frustration for me, is almost the admission I can't work in a full-time job anymore doing what I wanted to do, and I've had to stop my career because my new capacity is much more limited.
Yeah.
And then reframing that to, okay, well, if my new capacity is much more limited, what can I do within that? If, I have a few hours a week to talk to other people, to raise awareness and to help people, and that's all I have to give from an energy perspective, then I'm doing my best.
I think, with identities aren't fixed, and it changes whether, you're going through some kind of illness or just generally changes in life, whether that's family or elderly, whatever that is, and the key is really to adapt to the different situation that you're in, whatever that situation is, and almost like look at your identity and think, right, this is my situation now, this is my new normal, what can I do with whatever is going on in my life right now? And that may change again in a year's time or in 10 years' time. Things aren't fixed, and you should always look to be flexible and think, things will change, and when things change, I will be ready for that change and adapt my life accordingly. Because when you have that fixed mindset, that's where things can go wrong. Because if you are still in the mindset of, I need to go back to a job or a career for someone else, and constantly battling against that wouldn't have been good for you, for you in any way, shape or form. And you wouldn't have been able to achieve all the great things you've achieved so far,
Yeah, and I think when you asked earlier about, how do you feel about not eating again, or not eating like, a solid full meal.
Yeah.
And also about this, like, having that label of incurable or chronic. Chronic means that it will be here forever. And I sometimes think that for all of the negatives and for all of the suffering and for all of the trauma, actually, there's been so much growth in that for me. And it sounds a bit cliche to say, that through all of this adversity and trauma in life, we can come out the other side and we can learn from it and grow from it. But it has significantly changed my life, in some ways for the worst, yes, but in some ways probably better. Because without getting really unwell, I wouldn't have focused on myself and on my well-being. Without having gone through all of the surgeries and the issues and the chronic pain and the chronic fatigue, I wouldn't have learned how to regulate myself, how to manage my system better, how to give my body what it needs.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't have written, a 70,000 word book to try and help other people.
Yeah.
So actually, there is light to be found in the darkness. There is hope to be found in the despair. Everything is, duality. Life, you've got to see the light and the dark. You've got to see the good and the bad. And I do wish that maybe some of the practices I have now, I had in my 20s, or even, going into my early 30s. Maybe that could have helped me approach chronic illness from a much more resilient place.
Yeah.
I think I've always been really resilient mentally and really strong and, psychologically so. But I think maybe this has taught me about emotional resilience and about spiritual resilience and about building a life and curating and creating it for what I need, with my limitations or with the adaptations and with the flexibilities, rather than focusing on externally and on external validation, which often societally, that's what we do. We look for the next career progression or the next job or the next certificate or the next qualification or badge of honor. And burnout isn't a badge of honor. Getting chronically ill and being bedbound by it is not a badge of honor. It's unfortunate, and it's our bodies giving us these signs that we need to do something differently. We need to make a change.
Yeah.
And this condition and set of circumstances have taught me how to make those changes for myself and for my highest good, I suppose. And I'm confident that the next 40 years, I'm going to be approaching it with such a different mindset.
Yeah.
That it's going to help me thrive and flourish, even if I have to still, suffer with some really debilitating symptoms that are hard to describe to people and that are very much go unseen.
Yeah. Like I said,
Yeah, and unsaid, yeah.
Yeah. Talking to you now, and when I met you, I would never have known. If I'd met you on the street somewhere, I would never have known. I just wouldn't, because I can't see anything, and this is where I also think it's so important to let people know, and just say it how it is. This is what I have, and this is what I'm going through. You can't see it, but this is exactly how it is. Because one, I think that might stop people in their tracks in treating you in a certain way, or being unkind, or saying, oh, why can't Emily just do this, or whatever it might be. And secondly, it might make people understand, oh, that was a bit silly of me. Maybe there are other people that, I can't see things, and they might also be going through something. And then at least it gets that thought process going. So I'd encourage, as many people as possible to be as vocal as they can, they're comfortable with, and just letting people know, black and white, pretty much, this is what it is and this is how it is. So there you go. It's out in the open now. Yeah, but I know, I understand it's easy for me to say. It can be difficult. You can't just go up to people, or when you're in conversation, and say, oh, by the way, this is, how it is for me. One last thing I wanted to ask you is, knowing all the information you know now, and all the things, your journey, the huge journey you've been through, what would you do differently with the moment you stepped into the GP surgery, or whatever, knowing, to advocate for your health, really?
I think one of the things is evidence. So collecting evidence, even if that's making a note of when the symptoms happen, how they were happening, how they were showing up, what you'd been doing, because I didn't do that. So maybe possibly these visits were seen as ad hoc instances instead of being all linked and connected together. So build that whole story up by how it's affecting all the different parts of your life. So I would think, physically, how is this affecting me and impacting me? Mentally, how is it affecting me? Emotionally and spiritually, and actually keep a note of that. In my book, I've actually put a little, a suggestion of how people can start tracking, because with evidence, you can inform treatment and diagnosis and recovery and healing and looking for a way forward. And I think if I'd gone to the doctors in the early days armed with some evidence to say, look, I've been noticing this for this long, and this is when it's happening, and this is how it's happening, and this is what it's doing to my body, and this is how it's making me feel, I think maybe I would have been taken a bit more seriously. I've also, in terms of fatigue management and learning how to pace my energy, I wear a tracker which is called Visible, and it's all about making invisible illness visible. So it measures your heart rate and your heart rate variability, and it asks you questions on your symptoms. And again, you can actually download all the data into a PDF, and you can take it to your consultant or your doctor and say, okay, this is what's been happening over the last 12 weeks. And data and evidence and information, it's all feedback. So from that, you can deduce, certain, it might be diagnoses, or it might be ways medication are helping or not. It might be levels of stress in your life. It might even be triggers. You might be able to identify, okay, well, what triggered that choking episode for me? But for someone else, it might be what triggered that rash, or what triggered that headache, or that migraine, or whatever is different. So whatever you're monitoring or tracking, I would say data and evidence, and then openness. Be open, be authentic, and tell people your real story. Don't hide behind a mask. And don't shut yourself off from the world and pretend everything's fine when it's not, because that's worse for you in the long run. And it can be difficult to open up, and it can be difficult to, I suppose, admit to yourself the effect and the impact on your life, let alone admit to other people. But in the long term, I think your quality of life will improve if you can do that, if you can be open and honest and not hide from what's happening, but actually be accepting of it and acknowledge that this is the current situation. It might get better, it might improve, there may be more recovery ahead, but acknowledgement and getting it out in the open is a big part of the acceptance journey, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Emily, thank you so much for sharing your journey with me. It's been, great to kind of understand the fact that, with your book especially, chronic illness, what you have is something different and quite unique. I've never come across anything like this. But at the same time, I encourage anyone going through any chronic illness to perhaps even have a look at your book, because it's not specifically just about your illness. There's other things in there that can help them with their illness, whatever their illness might be. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks.